those who have worked with me in furthering conservation efforts know I'm a very devoted advocate, but blissfully unaware of the challenges and struggles everyone in this ballroom face. And instead, I am, in a way, a straw man for the administrator, that invisible party in today's conversation who represents a thud when matters of aspiration often come to the table. And I'm hoping to give you a feeling that, in fact, the only way forward, to use Jerry's expression, for all of us, is if we can get past the stereotypes. So think of me not so much as the administrator, but a person who represents those art historians, in my case, who have been pushed into a role of having to make some decisions. And we know the other protagonists in the way forward of the plus-minus dilemma. They include scientists and conservators. They include, I think, another portion of this landscape which is equally significant, and that's engineers. And I say that from the acquaintance I have as a director working closely with our chief operating officer and with the engineers who work with him, who valiantly struggle to do what they're told, which is often a changing scenario. And I think in looking at the ways in which they respond as engineers to the various directives that administrators and conservators and scientists give, they always come back with a question about what's the primary currency. There are three arenas in which we talk about the plus-minus dilemma, I would suggest to you. One is the longevity of examples of cultural heritage. I don't have to tell you that that's the game we're in, is longevity. It isn't necessarily permanent sustaining and preservation. The second is the currency question, literally the financial question, as one of the features and measurable units of what this dilemma yields as a question. And the third is energy itself, energy efficiency, carbon footprint, an imperative of a moral dimension that in some people's eyes trumps the first two. Not certainly in your eyes, I wouldn't suggest that, but I'm simply saying that there are those for whom the question of the consumption of energy on behalf of the longevity and the question of how much it costs are completely irrelevant to a larger moral obligation to work to the environment's betterment. But I think all I'm going to ask of our speakers today and of you and your questions is to recognize that we have three things in short supply in this debate. The first is candor. We made a decision at the IMA to present in real time on our dashboard on the web the relative humidity and temperature of our special exhibitions gallery. So I log on to it once in a while and see it dancing around, and don't take any pleasure in seeing it zigzag, but I'm always conscious that we have this limit that our conservators and scientists have given us to operate within. And I'm also conscious that, like any graph, sometimes this jumps around in ways that are unpleasant and discomforting. But without that, without revealing in real time the actual readout, as opposed to at the end of an exhibition looking at a readout that's been printed on paper by human hair, stretched and shrunk, we're really wearing a hair shirt of a living proportion. So candor, it seems to me, is essential when people take doctrinaire positions about museums must do this and they do this. In many instances, what museums say they do, of course, they don't do. And that's why I implore all of us to be straightforward and truthful when we make claims about, in fact, what range we do hit or don't hit. In our case, it was a simple matter of trying to find a clinical way of revealing it without having to talk about it, just show it. The second question I think we all need to look for is flexibility with each other's communities, the engineers, the conservators, the scientists, the administrators, flexibility in the face of the realities that we can't actually control our climates to the extent that we would like to. And at the same time, within that flexibility, look for that box in which we really do have to try to live, whether that box is a microclimate or whether it's the equivalent of someone putting on a sweater in a cool house, looking to insulate those most vulnerable examples of cultural heritage from degradation. The last point is the technical capacity. These systems in museums in particular were built at a time when human comfort was the ascendant value set, and the preservation of art wasn't understood to be something that a system, a builder of an HVAC system, had at the core. We use systems that are primarily designed for human comfort, and the extent to which we can tune those is obviously the point at hand. But the engineers I've spoken with have always said that these aren't adapted, ideally, for the preservation of art, but for the comfort of people. So that will be a dilemma that has to be faced down over time as well. The protagonists that we've brought together today are the very people we need to hear from, and so we'll get to them next. I'll simply mention them all by name at first, and then we'll make our way through in the interest of time. Nancy Bell is the head of collections care at the National Archives, London, and principal investigator of the Environment Guidelines, Opportunities, and Risks Initiative, known as EGOR. We'll hear next from Karen Colby Stothart, who's Deputy Director of Exhibitions and Installations at the National Gallery of Canada. We will continue with Cecily Grzywacz, who will tell us about her new role as well as facilities scientist at the National Gallery of Art. And we'll conclude with two speakers, Stefan Michalski, who is Senior Conservation Scientist and Conservation Sciences Division of the Canadian Conservation Institute, and lastly, Terry Draymond-Weiser, the Dorothy Wagner Wallace Director of Conservation and Technical Research at the Walters Art Museum. So we'll proceed apace and start with Nancy, and we'll have ample opportunity for questions afterwards. Pretty close to you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you developments that have been going on in the UK around this subject. This is really intended as a briefing note to tell you about some initiatives and the events that gave rise to completely rethinking environmental standards for cultural heritage collections in storage, in display, and in transit. This discussions of how to provide sustainable environments management has been really at the forefront of a great deal of thinking in the last 18 months, and operated very closely, or been very much around my world, only eclipsed in the recent week by trying to form a coalition government. But I can assure you that environmental standards are close on the heels of government issues. My comments will build on the first roundtable held in London, and as I said, just to give you a big overview of some of the broad issues and how they're being addressed. So why now? Why is this happening now, and what were the catalysts for change? I've tried to succinctly put it together in 3 points. One was a challenge to the conservation sector, following discussions of the BIGZO group of directors in 2008, museum directors Nicholas Sirota at Tate and Mark Jones, V&A, convened a small group of conservation professionals and other stakeholders to review current environmental standards in the age of energy restraint. So that's one issue. 2, regulation. Regulation always focuses one's mind, and all UK government departments are required to meet carbon reduction targets. And so, for example, the National Archives, where I work, has to reduce its energy consumption by 13% in 2010-11. And as you can imagine, the discussions develop out of that about where to cut energy. And it always seems to be often polarized between collections and other functions. The third catalyst was a discrete research funding program to fund interdisciplinary research in science and heritage and to build capacity in our sector, led to developing research clusters, one of which I led along with two other investigators from the Center of Sustainable Heritage and Tate. It was called Environmental Guidelines, Opportunities and Risks, and it tried to look at appropriateness of current standards for buildings, collections, and the people that work and visit our collections. It was 3 working groups and 67 practitioners, which included engineers, registrars, conservation scientists, etc., joined in. So what happened as a result of this? Well, I would say 2 big things happened. One, the research gaps necessary that we need to investigate were identified and prioritized for future research funding programs. And I would say that was one of the aims of the cluster. But the 2 things that were from that, priorities in research, were more material science, but more importantly, I think, to broaden this out, was understanding the relationship of damage of cultural heritage and the environment, and working towards defining a vocabulary of damage and the tools needed to measure it. And the 3rd priority for research was understanding how we value cultural heritage, who values it, and why. And that was viewed as bringing us as a potential, bringing us closer to understanding acceptable levels of damage to our collections. But 3rd, and the most important area that grew out of the work of the BISO group and Igor, was felt that there was a need now for developing a new standard. And as the original BS 5454 was an archive standard, it was thought that I was the ideal person to lead this, because what else would I be doing? So I'm pleased to say that on May 26th will be the first steering group. The UK is going to develop a new environmental standard. It's a discrete body of work that will feed into European environmental standards and other British standards. We're going to bite the bullet, and we're going to not make it sector specific. So it will cover materials in museums, libraries, and archives, and it will cover temperature, RH, pollutants, air, ventilation, and light. And it will take a risk-based approach. It will follow a lot of the work set out on the ASHRAE standards. It's going to be very difficult. It's got to be finished in 15 months. But I'm confident we can do it. Some of it will be wrong, but we have to get started somewhere. So I wanted to leave you with 3 key messages. In the UK, there is tremendous goodwill and cooperation amongst conservation professionals and practitioners, and there is a very good dialogue with museum directors at the moment who are listening to us. But that's predicated on the assumption that we can provide them the evidence and tools to convince them of our position. Research funding in the UK in the next 5 years will support a national strategy of research that aims to address some of the principal material science questions and other broader questions around risk associated with developing environmental standards. I would say that we have a tremendous opportunity as a profession to lead this debate. It's an international issue. It's not something that's just the US or Canada or Europe. And what better opportunity do we have than to really lead and influence and demonstrate that we can come up with the goods that our paymasters want.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Karen?
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. I believe the perspective that the organizers of this panel are hoping that I will bring is that of a senior manager at a major fine art museum, and to introduce a relatively broad field of view on the discussion. As Max has mentioned, I am Deputy Director, Exhibitions and Installations at the National Gallery of Canada. My responsibilities include development, planning, and management for the exhibition and loans programs at the gallery, and that includes programs on site in the gallery building in Ottawa, but also through our our fairly large traveling exhibition program. I should say that as a former conservator myself, by training and by practice, I do follow the literature on this topic with interest, including many very interesting recent articles by colleagues on the panel today. but I'm not here as a conservator today. My weighing in on the panel this afternoon is rather more from an operational perspective, and I'm very impressed with the efforts that I see within the conservation community to welcome and recognize the complexity of this dialogue and to bring a bit more of an interdisciplinary approach to the discussion at hand. This includes the point of view of those with direct professional responsibility for preservation and handling care, such as yourselves. It also includes the larger global perspective of the greening of museums and the museum operation. And it includes the perspective of museum directors and managers such as myself, who are responsible for maintaining a viable business operation. This is a very specialized business. Sometimes it's nonprofit, sometimes it's for-profit, public or private, but nonetheless it is a business, and we have irreplaceable collections at the center, so it's a very complex situation. The age-old intersecting mandates of preservation, appropriate use of the collections, and management all come together very nicely in this discussion. I'm going to take a very particular angle, which is obviously my professional perspective, which is that of the exhibition program as a driver in the discussion. Exhibitions figure very prominently in how the museum is perceived, particularly in fine art museums, how we reach our public, and this in turn drives revenues across the organization, which in principle feeds other core museum functions. So it's a very important part of the intersecting puzzle that keeps us going. As museum managers seeking to find the right balance between collection use and preservation, we spend a great deal of time assessing our programs, assessing the concepts, assessing the merits from an art historical perspective of loans or exhibition projects, whether or not they contribute meaningfully to art history, whether or not they advance our goals, advance a love and appreciation of the fine arts, who they reach, whether there's a legacy left behind from these projects, such as a publication, etc., etc. Whether or not art museums in Canada or in Europe or in the United States succeed in this search for balance, and the degree to which we should be or should not be building our exhibition programs into such a large part of the art museum operation is a whole other cup of tea, and that's a debate for another day. However, this said, the special exhibition programming pressures are here to stay, and I think that's fair to say. And in my experience over the past 15 years in my current line of business, I think this is as significant a driver as any other in the plus-minus dilemma. It obliges an intelligent discussion of the environmental norms because they feature so largely in the loan negotiation and the exhibition production process. The running of these complex, high-value exhibitions usually takes several years to organize. We're planning 2016 and 17 right now. They can involve as many as 50 to 60 different lending institutions. They require an equal number, if not double that, of contracts on individual works of art, very high insurance values, easily in the $500 million to $1 billion to $2 billion range. It's a big, specialized, risky, multi-million-dollar business. For the National Gallery of Canada, negotiation of environmental conditions with lenders and borrowers, and monitoring and managing these venues' abilities to deliver on the agreed norms, and in many cases troubleshooting, resolving the emerging difficulties that may come up with non-compliance by borrowing venues, can be among the more time-consuming and emotionally charged aspects of our day-to-day reality in running an art museum. So set against this context of exhibition programming, which lies at the core of the National Gallery of Canada's activities, alongside preservation and research, I don't want to lose sight of that, but nonetheless it's one of the big three. The key points that I wanted to put on the table, bearing in mind the hat that I'm wearing today, are number one, a quick outline of the environmental guidelines and experience we have at the National Gallery of Canada, where we have, by necessity, been working with a fairly flexible approach that's quite far removed from the old 50% plus minus 2. And we've had this in place for over 15 years, so I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And second, the flexibility and potential that a more nuanced and less rigid environmental standard presents at an operational level without loss of protection or any terrifying ramping up of loans volume or exhibition projects. To the first point, Canada, with its remote venues, very long travel distances, inconsistent museum infrastructure, and climatic extremes, has presented us with a sufficiently complex environment to thoroughly test our resolve and the resolve of our conservation department. Our current building is just over 20 years old, and this is not a problem. Of course, it functions beautifully and provides very precise environmental management. Due to the seasonal extremes of temperature that are common to Canada and particularly to Ottawa, we have chosen to make use of a winter setback strategy, and this is fairly common in Canadian museums. And we shift our relative humidity set point from 50% relative humidity plus minus 3% in the summer to 44% plus minus 3% in the winter, with a 2-month ramping up and down period in between seasons. This has been our practice for almost 20 years. It may be the case for many other museums out there. I don't know. I'm describing this to you for interest, and perhaps others will have questions. Our observations at this point is that our collections have managed this gradual shifting every year without harmful effect. And temperature is maintained at a constant 71 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, plus minus 2. We have a range of storage vault settings, but maintain most of our storages at a slightly lower relative humidity of 40% relative humidity plus minus 3%. And we have some special condition storages, including cool, 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and cold, 40 degree Fahrenheit rooms, mainly for the photographs and negative collections, and a vault devoted especially to silver magnetic tape storage, which we maintain at a lower 35% relative humidity. And all of the vaults are at 71 degrees Fahrenheit. We make use of microclimate and case solutions, as do most art museums, and to address other special needs, we will build microclimates, and also our special exhibition galleries can be isolated in a zone and adjusted slightly, should we choose to do that. And we did recently in a winter exhibition coming from Europe where we had some special painting requirements. But it is primarily our traveling exhibitions program that we call On Tour and our loans program that has really been the driver in shaping our environmental policy over the last 15 years. By virtue of the mandate of the National Gallery of Canada, we have to circulate our collections nationally. Our funding is dependent on this, and we have such a vast geography that it presents some very unique circumstances. Typically, we'll circulate 20 to 25 exhibitions a year outside of our normal programming within the building. In order to render this workable and maintain a very high quality in the projects available, our guidelines have evolved, and they contain set points which vary depending on the collection type and the media. There's also medium-specific fluctuation tolerances of plus minus 5% for some categories, plus minus 10% for other categories. Now, of course, bear in mind that there's always the option, and it is used, where we will set very specific guidelines for a particular exhibition that may fall outside of a straightforward assignment in one of those other categories. Our experience with this approach over the last decade does underline, and this is an extremely important point, the necessity for a very high level of understanding on the part of the conservation team, a high level of technical understanding, and comfort with providing technical assessment of the collections. It's a critical feature in a varied approach like this. It's labor intensive and it's knowledge intensive, but in a context such as ours, it provides the flexibility that we really need in order to operate a large-scale traveling program in a complex environment. On the second point, from a program management and design perspective, a clear understanding of the environmental needs of collections and building performances can play very directly into the operational management and program planning, so really at a management level. Buildings with less precise environmental control can be accommodated during moderate seasons, for example, and not during the extreme seasons. And high-quality programming can be developed with some fairly particular limitations in mind. We have done, and we will continue to do very customized projects that meet environmental restrictions depending on the venue. Beginning to think in terms of environmental classifications of the venues themselves, the objects, and even certain exhibition projects becomes possible if you make use of some of the categories such as the ASHRAE guidelines AA, A, B, C. For example, the management possibilities need not be complex, but I think the potential is easily appreciated. We're currently in the process of rewriting our loan policy. This is just coincidental. We do it every 5 years. This will involve some tinkering with some of the categories, I'm sure, but we will preserve the flexible and variable approach that we currently have in place. I think I'll leave it at that. There's more to discuss, but I'll wait for question and answers, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Cecily?
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. Okay. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm an analytical chemist, a conservation scientist with a passion for preservation of environments. I spent the first 25 years of my career as a conservation scientist at the Getty Conservation Institute, and in 2.5 months, I'll join the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in their facilities management program as a facilities scientist. But right now I'm in between, so I can say what I want because I'm not really representing anybody. But I am representing all of you and the engineers and the curators and conservators that I've worked with and talked with in the last 25 years. I think what's important today is that we realize, first of all, that there is no standard that's been written for temperature and relative humidity. We all have assumed that 70 and 50 are a standard that we must abide by. But the reality is there's no doctrine, no law that says that. That's just our perception. So we need to look at how we now deal with that in terms of energy efficiency, sustainability, and most importantly, protecting the art. As was mentioned by several people so far, and I'm sure it will come up again, there are so many players in this decision of what our set points should be. And this must be a communication process where we communicate throughout all the different decisions that we make. Not only because we need to not only inform each other, but we need to educate each other about our different skills and our different words, if you will. I mean, each conservation has one set of vocabulary, science has another, engineering has another. So unless we're talking to each other from the beginning and throughout this process, we need to be able to learn each other's vocabulary. In the past, I've sometimes blamed, and I'm admitting this, the conservators for wanting that strict temperature and relative humidity. And I was corrected by somebody, and I've heard this several times in the last year, that it's not really the conservators' fault that want strict plus or minus control on their collections. It's actually the registrar's fault. So I don't know if there's registrars in the audience, but that's what I was told. And then, of course, we all heard about the Boston meeting, and then there's the work going on in Great Britain about lending requirements. And it's because there is no definite answer for that fits all collections. The decision for plus or minus is based on the collection at hand and the quality of that and the integrity of that collection. I also throw this out, that I believe that a lending organization should not be able to require more strict control of temperature and RH than they themselves are providing the object. So you can't say, I want it, it's not, as I wrote here, loans are not a spa vacation for our collections and objects. So how do we decide what the best is? Well, we need to work with the engineers that design the HVAC systems, but we also know that in our buildings, many of which are existing buildings, we have almost historic HVAC systems. But there's a lot you can do to modify a historic HVAC system to improve its energy efficiency and still give quite tight controls. In the last 10 years, I've been working with ASHRAE, so if you don't know what that is, that's the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. It took a long time to learn their lingo, but I think I'm finally getting the hang of it. And I also worked quite closely when I was at the Getty with the facilities department at the Getty Center. And we need to include engineers when we have these dialogues. Engineers see it as their task to give you, the client, what you want. And they'll do that as long as you explain to them what you want. And even if it changes week to week, you continue that dialogue and they'll work with you. I mean, sometimes in some meetings I've been in, and the engineers were more concerned about the possible detrimental effects to the collection than some of the conservators were. And just not because they don't have that knowledge that conservation does. So it's very important we include everybody. We talked in conservation about an interdisciplinary approach, and the terminology for that when you talk to an engineer is an integrated building or project design approach. And that's where they're recognizing that even as an HVAC engineer, they need to work with security, with conservation, with curators, and with even the public to understand how to best design their systems for the buildings. So there is no number that we are going to come up with today as far as what the optimum temperature and humidity is. It depends on where your geographic location, it depends on the existing condition for that collection, and it depends, most importantly, on the actual object. We can learn about different materials' response to temperature and humidity, but we need to understand our objects, and that's where conservators are so important, because you understand the objects. That's why we need to dialogue with the directors and administrators as they decide they want to reduce energy use and save money to preserve the collection. In the engineering field, they have been addressing sustainability and energy efficiency for several years. We need to get on the back of their advances because museum is such a small niche that nobody's really going to do stuff for museums. But if we get involved with other organizations that are making advances and learning how to reduce their energy consumption, then we will benefit. But as it always is within conservation, we need to get on the backbones of other people that are actually making advances. We must be careful not to compromise or risk the collection to save money, save energy. When we buy a piece of art or an object, we take on the responsibility of good stewardship. And it's a long-term commitment. It's not just the fact that we're going to buy the object, we're going to restore it or conserve it. We are going to acquire that piece of art, and then we're going to preserve it for future generations. That means we include display of that object as well as the plus-minus dilemma that we're discussing today. Here we are, conservation organizations discussing the temperature and RH set points. Museum directors are also having discussions about this. Facilities managers have their own group and have been looking at benchmarking and trying to track the cost of energy and how they can reduce their costs as their budgets get cut. But we need to all come together, and hopefully these discussions like this will continue so we can use all of our expertise to come up with what's best for the collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecily. Stefan.
Thank you. I would just like to toot the horn for Cecily a bit more. It's not just that she works with ASHRAE. She was and is the chair of the committee which does the Museums, Galleries, Archives, and Libraries chapter. She was responsible for the 2007 edition, and it has been responsible for what will be the 2011 edition. It can often be a thankless task, but you are selected by older and wiser engineers who have done committee meeting chairing and know what's required. So I think that as a community, we can be very proud of Cecily's role within the organization of ASHRAE. And she did turn it into something. She changed the chapter. This is a little aside here, but she did change the chapter so that it could be called My Gal is the acronym for the chapter. So those of you wonder why it changed from something into galleries, archives, and libraries, she rearranged the wording so that she would have a nice acronym for her chapter. Fair enough. When you're the chair, you do get these little perks. But those librarians in the audience wondering why the chapter name changed, there it is. So who am I? I am a scientist in this area. I have done experiments, but I'm primarily a theoretician. I'm paid by Canadian taxpayers, so I do feel an obligation to advise them wisely and cost-effectively. I did train as a conservator at the master's level, but I was offered a job as a scientist, and even in the old days, one didn't turn down a good job offer. And so still, I value the wisdom that conservators and I can accumulate through our fingers and our eyes. This is still very much a tactile as well as a visual body of experience in terms of the effects of the environment. I'm a user of the heritage. I even visit museums on my holidays, not just when I'm working. I remember my teenage daughter rolling her eyes one day and saying, "Dad, you promised not to take any more pictures of cracks," because I was holding up the tour. There's a fantastic spiral crack. Did anyone see it last night in that huge picture with the man with the ugly face and the bad teeth? But it is the most perfect, flawless spiral crack I've ever seen in a painting. I'm going to go back tomorrow. I hadn't my camera. So I am then also a parent. Sustainability is not just global, it's not just local, it's personal. So how do we scientists approach these issues? There is not a cabal of mad conservation scientists who signed a secret manifesto to disagree with you conservators. And anyway, I feel that I'm a trained conservator. But we are a diverse group who play different variations on shared themes. The themes are familiar to you: biology, chemistry, and physics. So I'm going to run through those quickly. Biology. High RH causes mold. Green and brown stains, bad. No mystery there, I think. Chemistry. Moving on. 20 years ago, a chemist on a committee for standards in archives, Bill Wilson, called me. He was rather frustrated because the committee was divided on whether chemical issues, which pushed towards low humidity and low temperature, or mechanical issues, which pushed in the opposite direction, were more important. Bill, and he had discovered, I thought, the same way, that worrying about a little shrinking and possible cracking of archives was like worrying over a few broken dishes while the Titanic was going down. The consensus did move in favor of chemistry in the last decade for archives. But it's funny to think there was a time, not so long ago, when wise advisors to archives were not taking cold storage all that seriously. I think cold storage is an issue of due diligence for a large portion of 20th century art as well. If we want our grandchildren to understand a few pieces of 1920s celluloid, some constructivists, some Russian stuff, some 1980s polyurethane foam, Dali's red sofa, it's really in sad shape right now, they have a problem, etc., etc. Well, it's cold storage. Or we pass on profoundly deformed, yellowed, disintegrating messes. And saying, but we controlled the fluctuations I think it'll just sound silly. Inorganic chemistry, minerals, metals, glass, I don't think there's a big mystery there either. Know your materials, avoid very specific humidity thresholds, or your piece might disintegrate in a few hours, or it might not. So, that's the first three. And finally, the mysterious theme, the reason for this panel, which is the physics. So what is the model used by scientists in this area? The basic model considers a layer of material attached to some other material. I think you're all very familiar with this, but I'm just going to review it. One or both materials want to expand and contract as the fluctuations occur, but there is a mismatch between the two. So mismatch is the key word. Stress develops in each layer. At a certain stress, the material reaches its yield point. Beyond this, plastic deformation accumulates, and that part's irreversible. So there's the link between our terminology in engineering. Yield point equals irreversible. As stress increases further, the material fractures. We're all clear on that fracture is irreversible too. So when one uses data such as Mecklenburg's for artist paints, and he certainly contributed the largest set of data of use in this model, or industrial data for wood, or Mecklenburg's data for wood as well, the model shows yield does not begin until about 15% humidity fluctuation. In recent work by myself and by colleagues in Europe on the roles of fatigue, on the role of stress relaxation and hysteresis have been explored. And I think it's fair to say that consensus remains among the group that for this model, plus minus 10% humidity would be a non-damaging fluctuation. As for temperature fluctuations, they do not begin to even approach the yield threshold until paints are hot enough to be softening or wood is scorching. On the low side, materials must be dropped well below freezing to approach yield. At these conditions, the risk, as I'm sure many of you know, is not due to the shrinkage so much as the glassiness of the materials and their greatly increased vulnerability to poor handling. So, is this model connected to reality? The model is not representative of all forms of object. So that's truth or dare. It's not entirely representative. Confession. But it does represent a heck of a lot of acres of objects. Paintings on stretchers, paint on wood, gilding on wood, lots of furniture, architectural trim, etc., etc. It does represent the transient response of a single thick layer which restrains itself. It greatly overestimates the risk to a lot of objects that have little internal restraint, like 99% of works of art on paper, textiles, leather. So you will ask, what do I think? What objects does it underestimate? It underestimates any rigid assembly where the stress concentrates. It's an old engineering term before computer modeling of fracture. They talked about stress concentration. For example, a paint layer with deep impasto, notched wood elements such as bas-reliefs, paint and gilding over joints such as arm joints of polychrome, joints in panel paintings. But it's fair to say these locations usually cracked a long time ago. They've been restored century after century, and you know it, and I know it. But I also know that when these objects need repair, and I think you would agree, it's typically due to events far beyond plus minus 10% humidity. So it doesn't get us out of the uncertainty box yet. How do we get a handle on the true sensitivity of these canaries? Because that's what I think we want to know. How many of them and how do we qualify them? What do collections tell us? Mervyn Richards of the National Gallery and Sarah Staniforth of the National Trust, each of whom has been responsible for thousands of objects and hundreds of exhibitions, have stated, and they can qualify this of course, that they have lived with a de facto range of 40 to 60% humidity for many years, and that they have not seen damage that they would ascribe to humidity or temperature fluctuations. They've all said that they've seen a lot of handling issues. And I would add that they do have qualifications on how one interprets 40 to 60 range, but at least that's out there on the table. The British Museum has recently adopted a range of 40 to 60% as its benchmark for exhibitions and loans in their own works. I don't believe it was based on a hunch or that they felt pressured. I'm sure it was based on admittance that most of their collections are already in that range or worse, let's not say worse, or wider. Even I slip into old habits and assumptions. They're wider fluctuations. We don't know if they're worth. And they just don't see a problem. So this is what they're, in terms of reality, the reality is 40 to 60 at least, and it hasn't been an issue before, so why would it be tomorrow? What is my advice in the end? Well, when I consider the science plus the evidence of collections, I still reach the same advice that we drafted for the ASHRAE chapter now 12 years ago, which is that plus minus 5% humidity means no risk of physical damage, that plus minus 10% RH means a small risk of physical damage, but only to high susceptibility objects. And we're back around the circle again. Do I think there are many high susceptibility objects? No, I don't. And apparently neither do the people who have seen many, many collections subjected to these conditions. One final note, although most of our attention is focused on acceptable RH fluctuation, I think the bigger benefits for sustainability, for carbon footprint, are in an expanded range of permissible temperatures. The difficulty for that will be in convincing users to accept warmer summer conditions and colder winter conditions. I don't think the collections will care at all until people are screaming blue murder. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Now things are warming up. I'm sure you'd agree. And we'll move on to Terry.
Good afternoon. I am going to be speaking from the perspective of a conservator who has to give recommendations in a museum for climate settings. And I see that from the size of the audience here that there's a great deal of interest in the topic that we're discussing today. So that's really very, very good to know. The evaluation of museum climate standards is not new for conservators. In fact, some have already broadened acceptable ranges with slow, controlled movement to set points according to the season. But the climate change and museum collections roundtable at the IIC meeting in London in 2008, and the more recent forum on rethinking the museum climate held at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston have once again focused our attention on this subject. And we are being encouraged to reevaluate our approaches to museum climate standards to accept much broader parameters for RH and temperature and wider fluctuations than in the past. The rationale being that this is good for the current and future economic and energy crises and the global movement towards green technology and sustainability. Most conservators I know are concerned about these large looming issues, but we also consider ourselves advocates for the preservation of works of art for today and for future generations. We know that working toward environmental sustainability and collection care need not be mutually exclusive. What we need is a way to make informed decisions. From my own observations, what have been called the magic numbers have not led to harm for works of art, and in fact, they give us a range that is compatible with most of the diverse objects in many of our collections. When the environment has drifted outside of that range, I have seen changes and damage to works of art that are very sensitive to fluctuations and to many materials that are inherently unstable and require specific limited RH ranges. For many years, conservators have been aware of the issues surrounding compatible RH for works of art in historic as well as many modern structures. And at the Walters, we have moved set points in one of our vulnerable buildings to accommodate seasonal changes to prevent condensation and mold growth. To protect vulnerable objects in these spaces, we install less reactive materials during certain seasons and use climate-controlled vitrines. Other conservators have made creative accommodations to preserve collections under different circumstances. Yet some have suggested that U.S. conservators are stubbornly adhering to outdated standards since scientific testing has demonstrated that no permanent damage occurs in RH ranges from 40 to 60%. For me, a major stumbling block to accepting much broader overall fluctuating RH is that I'm not yet convinced that existing testing of materials for behavior in wider parameters is applicable to real works of art. The research that supports this broader range meets the highest standards and has produced very important data for our consideration. However, I am concerned that it cannot model the full set of variables normally seen with complex objects, especially those that have been through many permutations and changes already. I'm also concerned that the empirical evidence reported by conservators does not comport with the scientific conclusions. Certainly, the recent work cited on the AIC Environmental Guidelines DIS list from Met conservation scientist Dr. Paolo Dionisivici convinces me that it is premature to assume that we know enough about how actual works of art respond to environmental fluctuations to make informed decisions. We need more research to determine whether permanent damage occurs in hygroscopic materials in the broader ranges, especially with unlimited fluctuations. We also need to evaluate damage from chemical changes and biological activity at wider ranges of RH and temperature. For example, what happens to works of art at higher RH in the presence of pollutants, insect pests, and biofilms? In many instances, existing display cases will need to be replaced or reconfigured to become more efficient and effective for microclimate control. Based on the nature of the collections in my care, our buildings, and a desire for a sustainable future, I will advocate for judicious use of wider RH and temperature parameters and seasonal settings whenever possible and practical. I will look to continued research to further inform my decisions. Conservators must not feel pressured to abdicate their professional responsibilities, but must also be willing to reevaluate standards based on reliable and realistic data. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Terry. And I think at this point, with these very helpful and candid presentations, we can move on to some questions. I would seize the microphone for a minute myself with a selfish question, because we're welcoming the members of the 200 Museum Directors Association, the AAMD, to Indianapolis in less than a month. I need an elevator speech about today's gathering. So who would like to hazard the elevator speech? And then we can see if any brickbats fly to synthesize what we've heard. Anybody want to take a run at that? I'm on my own? Yeah. That's not any good. That's not going to work. The last thing you want is me to do that.
It's your job.
It's my job. Okay. Well, there's an abdication. I will never forget when standing in front of a sculpture by Klaus Oldenburg, which had been in a private collection and was in an institution I directed. He looked at it. It had clearly been in a living room somewhere by a window. And that was obvious from the condition of one side of it by the window. And he looked at it and said, "It's dead." So I didn't know quite what to do at that point, and no one was able to help in the immediate short term. But I think there's another voice in all of this, which is the artistic intent and the degree to which the author of an object sees something. Most of the objects we care for, of course, are by authors long gone. But I think the intention of the artist is always something that we need to come back to as well as we look at what we call preservation. And the other point I would make is, I think, Stefan, you raised this in our phone call, when we measure RH and temperature, where are we measuring it? Is it on the wall? Is it on the floor in the hygrothermograph? Is it with a kind of average of returns? It isn't quite so simple as to say, here is the readout, here's the percentage, and we certainly recognize that with the information we put on our website. With that, I'd love to see if any of you has questions for any of the others before we turn to the floor. Thinking that might be the case. Terry.
Well, I would just like to make a kind of a general comment, and that is that I think that none of us are really that far apart on what we're saying. I think that what I hear mainly is that we need a lot of collaboration amongst the scientists, the conservators, the engineers, the administrators, and I think we need to find that way to develop some sort of platform for that. And I don't, this might be a heretical thing to say, but has AAMD considered having conservators come and speak to that group?
Mm-hmm. We have in the past, and we certainly will in the future. I think this is a very specific topic that we haven't focused on before, but will be doing. So thank you. We have microphones in the aisles. I encourage anyone at this point who'd like to ask a question of our panelists, please step forward. And sir, would you be the first?
Gary Frost from University of Iowa. I've always been confused in relation to the commodity and bulk collections like libraries and archives, why we are predicating the monitoring on air conditions without correlation to the aspiration in and out of free moisture in these commodities, because it appears, to my experience, to be two different rate-related phenomena going on.
Who would like to take that? Stefan?
I'm not entirely clear on the question, but let me just say what the model we use, and we think it's legitimate, is that the books or the commodities are in equilibrium more or less with the air. And I would agree, actually, I'm going to use this as a segue into a point I wanted to make, which is that when we speak about these humidity specifications within ASHRAE and other places, I really do think of them as a performance specification at the object. Our responsibility is to say what the object needs, not to interpret that and transform that into, therefore we think that probably you're using a mechanical system, so probably this is what we should totally engineer. That's a separate transformation with its own issues, because sometimes people want to use the same standards to design a silica gel display case, or they want to use it to measure risk by putting a probe right next to their commodities and saying, this is what I'm measuring in equilibrium within 0.5 millimeter of my book. That is what we're talking about here, is what is the correct, not so much correct, what are acceptable ranges of the air conditions in equilibrium with the objects which keep them safe. So in a way, I suppose I'm saying, if we clarify the issue, I think it's removing your objection.
Well, I could put it another way. If we took the commodity out of the library and archives, there would be much greater volatility in the air fluctuation of the relative humidity, that the cellulosic commodity actually buffers
Certainly.
The whole exchange that we're seeing.
No, I agree that if you have a library with a mechanical system, you essentially have a locomotive train that's got 5,000 crates, trailers full of dead weight. And to actually talk about the extent to which the locomotive speeds up or slows down the whole train is a complex issue. But in the end, it does keep moving because the locomotive is going in a particular direction. But you're right, the tail on that dog is very large and heavy, and sometimes it's doing the wagging. But I don't see that's a separate issue in terms of control dynamics of a box. You're right. When we're trying to control a big space full of cellulose versus not full of cellulose, it has slightly different dynamics. But yeah.
If I can just add a point to that, which is, I think you show neatly that this is all about different contexts and different materials, and we have to always keep that in mind whenever we're coming up with our strategies for environmental management. In my own collection, we actually have the box, 187 kilometers of the stuff, and are looking at and have determined the buffering capacity of those boxes and the material as a means of reducing energy cost. So gives us a lot more flex in using the HVAC system in a more efficient way.
Very good. We're going to bounce back and forth from mic to mic, and so, sir, you'll be next. Thank you.
I've got two items. One is that anecdotally, I'm hearing a lot about fatigue these days, and that due to the tightness of the requirement for the temperature and RH, that we're setting up a cyclical flutter as opposed to a longer, slower movement over a larger area, and in the process establishing potential fatigue. The other thing is that within the last month, a group of folks with ICOMOS have been looking at starting a building systems working committee that's also looking into a lot of the same sorts of parameters and so forth, as well as some of the basic questions of why do we consider it reasonable to lose 30% of our building every time we do a mechanical upfit. But
Cecily?
just two items for
I guess my first response is that if we all need to be working together, because if ICOMOS is doing it and IIC and AIC, and then I try to work with people to help capture it in the ASHRAE chapter, I mean, the problem is we're each doing it independently, and this is not a large field. We don't have enough research, and we do not have enough resources. So my call out is we need to start communicating these things better. And I don't know if this answers the first part of your question, but everybody's been giving examples of what they've seen with strict or without strict environmental control, and it seems like we need to somehow be able to capture honest results and observations and make that available to all of us. I mean, maybe it is only 1.5% of the collections that suffer when you go plus or minus 10%, or maybe it's 10%. But until we start capturing the observations and be honest about it and what we're able to achieve, we can't move forward. And there is not that data out there. I don't know how to get it, but.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Rachel Aronstein. I'm a conservator in private practice, and I deal with institutions of varying sizes and preventive care projects. And I think most institutions have a far greater percentage of their material in storage than on display. And several of you mentioned the idea of tailoring storage environments to the varying needs of the collection. But for the most part, institutions have their stuff in storage. Generally, they don't have enough room in storage, for what they already have. And with the exception of groups of material like maybe a metals, storage or cold storage, things are generally grouped by, department or, object type. And so the conversation of, well, you have these different storage rooms, and this room seems to be able to maintain tighter controls, and these spaces aren't. Maybe we could talk about reorganize, is sort of a non-starter. So what do you do about trying to tailor conditions in storage when that seems to not be a conversation based on workload and space that anyone's really willing to have at a practical level?
I can take a little bit of a stab at that, and that is that you're absolutely right. But I think that it's sometimes opportunistic. If there's a renovation that's taking place, a new building being created, that the conservator coming in sort of on the ground floor with the engineers and everybody else to help design and make suggestions. We're going through a process right now where we're looking at various buildings and spaces. Things are being moved around, and we're moving things that do not require really close monitoring and strict standards. We're putting them in a space that has some climate control, but it's not going to be as controlled as other places. The other, and this comes back to, I think, what Gary Frost was saying as well. We were moving things out of our library. Where were we going to put the books? Well, the thought that I had was, why not put the books from the library around the outside of the storage area? That this would then act as a buffer for the storage area, so you'd require less energy to keep the storage area. And so it's doing these little creative things that whatever you can. But it is also, I think, another person that needs to be brought in on this is the curator, who could be perhaps persuaded that the objects from all the curatorial areas could be mixed together but divided by their preservation needs rather than by their particular area.
Are you trying to start a conversation among curators? Radical stuff, Terry. Go right here, please.
I want to sort of define some turf here, because we're talking about several different things and not really stating them clearly. And one of them is, it seems to me that what we're really talking about here is art museums and big fancy art museums. And that's the first thing. And I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying this is, I think, really what we're talking about. And a lot of you have said art over and over again. And we're talking about things with the greatest value and also the things that have most prestige from traveling around. I think, from my practice, we've been doing the kind of detail-oriented planning that a lot of people have talked about. Is it a structure or historic? Are the things in vitrines? All of those things. And I think there really is a lot of agreement about looking at the collections, looking at the building, looking at the budget, looking at all the climate, whatever. And actually, I must say that the only experience I've ever had with 50/70 is when lenders require it. And that's, in my practice, it's been the most absurd people who require it. That is, collections. I had collections once of high-fired ceramics, and a private owner wanted 50/70. But I think really there's a huge amount of agreement. It's just trying to describe it that falsifies what we're saying. So I think that's the box we're in, and I'm not unhappy with that one. But once we're talking about going green, reducing our energy use is not the only way to do it. And clearly, if we change our energy sources, we're in a whole different ballpark. And Toledo is, for me, from what I know, Toledo is, I think, the best example of that. And another slightly less pleasant idea is that international loans are hugely ungreen by their definition. And my guess is that in places, unfortunately not in the United States, in places that have already made rules about reduction, my guess is that the emissions from the travel of shows don't show up in calculations of whether you're going greener or not, which is an unfortunately embarrassing fact. That's
a great provocation. On the other hand, moving 500,000 people by plane to see the object somewhere else has another carbon footprint result. So my only point is I think we need to pick up our speed in brevity, because the lines are emboldened and lengthening and the time is shortening. So thank you for your intervention, and we'll move over here.
My question was, no one has actually addressed the green effects of changing the parameters that we are already using, or loosening the parameters to the plus or minus 10, which many of us do anyway because our systems don't do anything better than that if we're lucky. I think that a number of years ago there was Karen published the ranks of light sensitivity and how many lux hours, so that we could, as helpers in collection care in a museum environment, talk to curators about what they wanted as an acceptable level of damage or risk to their collections. I would like to see that component of what are we saving, what are we gaining, how do we do that? Because is that coming out from your group as well, or is that coming from another group of people? Please. That's my question. Because having that data to provide helps discussions with chief financial officers and HVAC people and that sort of thing. Thank you.
I wasn't able to elaborate in my 6-minute, pardon? But I was just going to say that your priorities are the priorities of other research programs, and they're really good comments and questions to be asking, but I don't think we have good evidence now about energy saving, the relationship of energy saving and stewardship. So that's yet to be explored further.
Okay. We'll go over here.
Yes, I just wanted to comment again. I am Barbara Mangum. I was the conservator and chief conservator at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. I was there for 14 years. And we undertook a 2-year study of the climate there, both looking at cause and effect. So I worked with Nathan Stolo on this, who many of you may know, in terms of just doing relative humidity, temperature data. We did light data. We did mapping of lights. We did all kinds of monitoring of the environment. And then on the other hand, we tried to look at how our collection, which is a very, very diverse collection, it's in kind of, if you don't know the Gardner Museum, it's in what is essentially a Venetian palace in Boston, but lots of different materials on the inside, and essentially it had not had any climate control other than heating for about 100 years. And the collection was in such poor condition. It had experienced so many different fluctuations. Finally, we did get climate control in, and it was seasonally adjusted from like 35 to 55. But it was very, very clear that the collections that really just could not handle that were things like veneered woods, lacquer, anything that had a salt associated with it. Like you might get crystal glass, you might get stone. Also, not just the relative humidity and temperature, there certainly was the combinations. At times we did see effects where a high temperature and high relative humidity just reacted so quickly with the painting, for instance, that you could really see that that was a very different reaction than your normal kind of relative humidity, temperature thinking. But also, I just wanted to say we did wind up using a lot of vitrines, and what we did was, over that 2-year period, get to know the collection very, very well, almost on an individual basis. And we put little hygrothermographs around in different little areas, just so we could see what that local climate was like within the bigger place. And we found, very significant differences. Like by a window was, we know this, by a window is very different than on an internal wall. But as we got to know all these things, we were able to then really tailor those specific areas and that particular issue with that object. And that was really interesting for me to see just how much we could do that and eliminate so much damage. We did also dimensional, in terms of trying to evaluate the effect of the climate on the objects. We were doing weight studies and dimensional studies and things like that. And eventually a lot of that material had, or data had already been produced in the literature, and it was a matter of just, saying, oh, guess what, that does affect, objects.
I'm going to have to thank you for the intervention.
Sure, thank you.
We'll try to wrap up fairly soon, so we'll move over here, and we have a few more minutes. I'll be watching how many people start heading for the exits, which will let us know when to start wrapping up. Sir.
J.P. Brown, the Field Museum. I'll try not to be too boring. The first thing, I wanted to push back a bit to Cecily. I think it's fine to require more stringent environmental conditions than you have in your museum. I really don't see a problem with that. If I lend something to someone, I want them to be more careful with it than I am.
But then the change between what it's used to being and how tight you're requiring it to be somewhere else, that's also a damage, potential risk for damage.
No, I don't. I mean, it could be, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
The second point is, I think we're ignoring the question of the built environment, which is a lot of how our energy use is required. If you have big atrium spaces, controlling the environment in them is very hard. So it's not just about whether you have air conditioning, but what kind of building you're putting it into. And if we're going to talk about green, we need to talk about building form as well as talking about recurrent energy cost. The third thing is that I totally take Stefan's point about performance-based specifications. But I do think that when you actually get down onto the ground, there is some stuff about helping people with implementation, which is really important. If you go to an engineer and tell them, you know, I need this, and they really don't have any idea how to do it, it's important that there are people out there who can give them a starting point and help them work through it. That's all I had to say.
I can answer a couple of those with respect to the building. I mean, coming from the engineering side, the engineers do, and also conservation looks at the building as a building envelope. And you can't control the climate unless you understand the building. And there are people that are out there that know how to help train. I don't think it's an engineer that you're speaking with, more like a technician or than an actual engineer who's doing the design work, but that could be semantics. But we do know how to do all that, and you're absolutely right. We do need to be able to communicate how they achieve this, and that's one of the beauties, if I may put my plug in, for ASHRAE, because they have all this material available for the HVAC engineer. Yes, it's hard to get, and I mean, yes, it's hard to know as a conservator what to go for, but that's where you need to integrate.
That wasn't really my point.
Lost it.
What I was trying to say was that performance-based. I remember when we were talking about Gary Thompson's book in the 90s, one of the things that we were concerned about with it was that there wasn't much on actual environmental damage. There was a lot on, you know, how to tweak the lighting and things like that, but not how much damage it actually caused. That's something that we've been rectifying over the last 10 or 15 years, but I think I think sometimes we do lose sight of the question of how you actually do these things, what the implementation details are. And I don't think it's adequate for conservation just to sit there and keep asking for stuff which may not be achievable. I think it's important that they're actually able to come forward in partnership with engineers with solutions that work.
Thank you. We're starting to see a diaspora, so we'll take a couple more questions. Please.
This is a short
brief
comment.
ones and
Short comment. I'm going to read it to make it even shorter.
a little louder, please. I'm sorry.
Hello?
Hello.
Why not involve architects also, who have experience designing museums, so that they can, in addition to contributing ideas about structural realities in building design or redesign, can also become sensitized early to our concerns?
They are included a lot within it depends on the architect, but it depends on anything. I mean, ASHRAE, again, the engineers work a lot with architects, and kind of like conservators like to get mad at registrars and administrator, you know, the engineers do not like architects, but architects do not like engineers. So we all need to get along and communicate, but it's an excellent point.
Sir.
Richard Kirshner, Shelburne Museum. This is not a new discussion for those of us who have worked in historic houses. We've been discussing this for the last 15 years, and in fact, the ASHRAE standards are one of the results of that. And I just want to ask that as we move forward that we don't reinvent the wheel. ASHRAE's gone to a lot of work to put together this chapter. Unfortunately, you got to know an engineer and take them to dinner to be able to read it, because you've got to buy it, subscribe to ASHRAE. Now, the information is out there in the IIC site, and that's what we need to get around. The one thing that I get a bit discouraged about was at the Boston seminar, we talked about a different model, which is a box of 40 to 60. Well, let's keep with the ASHRAE, you know, plus or minus 10, plus or minus 5, plus or minus 15, and not get confused about a box that you can't step out of.
Thank you.
A couple very quick comments and then a question for you, actually, Max, which is that one is many of us who have worked with exhibitions and loans over the years are well aware of the fact that many of the institutions we deal with in Europe, for example, are dealing with 55% plus or minus 5, or we're lending institutions that have 45% plus or minus 5. So this reference to the fact that many of us have been lending to other institutions that did not match exactly our institution is absolutely true, and it's only anecdotal information that suggests that the amount of damage that's been seen has been minimal, if at all. Now, That being said, having discussed this topic extensively with many colleagues, many of the people that work with me at the gallery, I think that when we talk about, the issues of 40 to 60 and 16 to 25, the biggest concern is the idea of free-floating between those extremes versus the idea of having more minimal fluctuations like plus or minus 5, but with some seasonal adjustment. You might have 45 plus or minus 5 in the winter and 55 plus or minus 5 in the summer. So those are certainly some of the concerns being expressed. As a director, Max, very involved in this issue and about to discuss it at length at AAMD, what is it that we need to convey to museum directors in America in order to move forward in coming up with at least an interim specification, and also in terms of discussing what additional research may be done to supplement the good work that's been done by Mary and by Stefan and other people involved? As a museum director, what do you think we should be doing?
Well, I don't want to dodge the question, but I would say consistency is what would help directors, because it is exactly the variability of opinion and the diversity of perspectives of people who are highly regarded in different parts of this enterprise that creates confusion for directors. And I wouldn't make the assumption, and I know you're not, that directors are wooden creatures for whom bottom line is all that matters. Most of us are art historians in the art museum field. That's how we started and we continued. So I think we're looking for the best possible advice that's synthesized from a collective opinion that this very group is capable of arriving at. And no one is going to act precipitously to abandon ship from the standards that are generally in the air, if I can call it that, today. So I think arriving at a more thorough, reasoned, and syncopated result is what the directors need. So it's coming across different points of view. Thank you. I think we are out of time, actually, we're over time. But it's okay by the organizers if we do that, and again, we'll do it by the clattering of hooves out the door to know to stop. Sir.
Okay, nobody move. Rob Waller with Protect Heritage in Ottawa, and actually I have a question for Max. I guess in the slight disagreement between Cecily and JP, I'd come down on Cecily's side, thinking, at least to my mind, it would seem unethical for an institution to demand more stringent controls for a loan than they're able to accomplish themselves. In any of these kind of big changes that we try to get going in a field, it seems it's really helpful if all of us can look in our own particular area for low-hanging fruit. And I think most of you have done that, and Terry's done that in terms of saying, sure, we're going to look at any collections we can and look for where we can reduce our costs of maintenance by identifying specific items that need better care or whatnot. But it seems to me that at a museum director level, if there were a commitment to not requiring specifications for a loan object that were much stricter than the museum is actually capable of achieving itself, then that would send a strong message that directors are really behind being consistent and coherent and whatnot.
I completely agree, and that's why I started out speaking of the need for candor, and why by putting on our website the actual real-time readouts, we're saying to those lenders and borrowers with whom we work around the world, here are our standards, these are the ones we hope you could meet. So, thank you.
Could I just interject something, and that is that I think that a lot of people may think that most conservators do put these very stringent limitations on loans, and we do, in fact, I know for our museum, we do in fact ask what the parameters are at the borrowing institution. We don't ask that question because we're going to turn the loan down. We need to know what kind of environment the object is going into, and we are dependent on that institution being honest with us about what their climate control and capabilities are, et cetera. And we will ask for charts for that loan period in that space to show what really is going on. We then base our decision on whether that object must be in a climate-controlled vitrine or what it does need when it arrives there based on that information. We're not asking that information because we want to turn down the loan. The other thing I just wanted to interject right here is that if, in fact, we all are adopting these very fluctuating, or at least these broadened parameters, it really is very important to know what's happening where you're sending something. If you have opted for a seasonal set point, let's say, of closer to 40%, and you're sending it someplace else in the world where they're in a season where they've opted for close to 60%, you're not going to get just a 10% change. You may be sending your object to a much broader range without really thinking about it. So it is really important for us to know what's happening and what the set points are, where the objects are going.
So that's great for east-west loans then. That's right. Yes.
In trying to define or to understand what you're saying, I keep running across something that I think is missing. I think defining the range is incomplete. I think that a relative humidity flux between 40 and 60% over 2 months is vastly different than a flux over 2 hours. And we're not specifying time, not for the materials and not for both in defining what the materials are capable of and what the space is capable of within a time period. And I just want you to comment on that.
Who are you asking?
Anyone.
Yeah.
Well, the short and complex answer is actually, I think you're probably presuming that one of those conditions is universally more dangerous than the other, but I can pick an artifact for which one is more dangerous, and I can pick another artifact for which the slow change is more dangerous, like a heavy piece of furniture. So, but you're right, that we do understand those sorts of more detailed understanding of what's involved in the specifications and in fluctuations. I'm more comfortable myself, as somebody raised, with the ASHRAE way of formulating the fluctuation. We don't say you can be between 40 and 60. We say you can have 50% plus minus 10 is an A classification. And that's not the same as saying you can have your thermostat set at 40 one year and 60 another time of the year, plus whatever fluctuations.
But I would like to know for specific materials even, what is safe? At what rate can things change within a range?
Well,
so that, and then we can design microclimates, because I think ultimately that's going to be the more feasible solution, trying to, not changing the whole building, but making an enclosure that fits the parameters of the object.
I'm going to be kind to Paul, because I know if I start to answer that question, the meeting will wrap up with it. So over to you, Paul.
I'm a little confused about what the goal of all of this is. If it's to reduce the carbon footprint, that's one thing. If it's to reduce the cost of running the institution, that's a little different. If it's to go green or to get LEED certification, those are also two different things. I think that we're confused about it because we need to also enlist all the other people who are dumping all of this in our laps. Architects who design buildings that are all made out of glass, where daylight cannot be excluded for half the time when no one's in the building, and thus cause huge amounts of expense for no reason whatsoever. That's one problem. If we want to go, the way the LEED certification is written, you don't get any points, or very few points, for daylight issues, for excluding daylight, and actually for including daylight, you actually get points, which doesn't help us at all. So I think, and if the architects can be allowed to do anything they want, but we can't, I think that's not fair. And and I would suggest that the visitor has and the staff have responsibilities too. By turning the temperature down in the winter 5 degrees in our part of the country, we could raise the humidity easily without doing any damage to the collection and do a lot of good. And yet, if we don't, and we could put signs up that warn visitors to keep their sweaters on in the winter and enlist their responsibility in helping to preserve their heritage. So I think that if you don't include all of the stakeholders in this kind of an issue, and it's only up to the conservators and scientists and everything, we're only one side of the equation.
I can't think of a better way to bring today's session to a close. I want to thank all of our panelists for putting so much thought into this and providing us with great experience of their careers and making an open discussion. I hope you all felt an opportunity to participate. We thank the AIC and the IIC and all of you very much. Once again, thanks so much.